Earth had only recently begun to venture beyond the confines of its own solar system when the unthinkable happened. An invitation arrived from the Zathar Dominion, the most powerful and ancient empire in the galaxy, a species that had dominated and conquered worlds for centuries. Their reputation for ruthlessness and efficiency was unparalleled. The invitation was unexpected and came as a shock to humanity's leaders, for the Zathar had never shown any interest in Earth before, and their arrogance left little room for doubt that they viewed humans as nothing more than a primitive species still struggling to survive in the vast expanse of space. The message was clear. The Zathar wanted an ambassador from Earth to join the royal court of Zathar Prime to attend a grand diplomatic gathering where key decisions about the galaxy's future would be made. For the first time, humanity was invited to participate on the galactic stage. The message seemed almost condescending, and yet there was no denying the opportunity it presented. Earth could either accept or risk being left behind forever in the dust of galactic politics. Cass Riley was chosen as the human ambassador to represent Earth at the Zathar court. She was not the most senior diplomat, nor the most experienced, but her reputation for sharp intellect and unshakable resolve had earned her this assignment. Cass had always been the one to speak her mind and stand firm when others backed down. That was why she was entrusted with this task. She would be Earth's voice in the court of the galaxy's most fearsome empire. But she also knew the weight of the responsibility she was about to undertake. As Cass boarded the sleek alien ship that would carry her across the stars to Zathar Prime, she couldn't help but feel the gravity of the situation. The Zathar were ancient. They had seen and conquered countless species throughout their long reign, and now Earth was to be introduced into that world, a world where humanity was still viewed as nothing more than an insignificant speck compared to the grandeur of the Zathar Dominion. The journey was long, and the silence in the ship's observation deck was only broken by the occasional hum of the engines. Cass spent much of the trip reflecting on what was ahead. She knew that she could not afford to make mistakes. There could be no missteps, no showing of weakness. The Zathar would be watching her every move, waiting for her to slip up and prove their belief that humanity was unworthy of being in their presence. When they finally arrived at Zathar Prime, Cass was awestruck by the sheer scale of the city sprawled before her. It was a massive metropolis built into the heart of a towering mountain range. The buildings were made of materials unlike anything she had ever seen. The architecture was ancient yet futuristic, and everything seemed to radiate power, from the gleaming towers to the energy fields that surrounded the royal palace. Cass was escorted into the heart of the palace, where she was introduced to the ruling class of the Zathar Dominion. The Zathar Emperor, Lord Salkar, was the first to speak, his voice deep and commanding as he welcomed her in front of his court. His tone was polite, but there was no mistaking the underlying condescension. His eyes flickered over her, as if measuring her worth. In a single glance, Cass met his gaze and stood tall. She would not be intimidated. She would make them see humanity for what it truly was. Cass stood before the Zathar court, feeling every gaze from the gathered alien dignitaries, as if it were a physical weight, each one of them observing her every movement, their eyes filled with judgment and curiosity, some with disdain, others with amusement. Lord Salkar sat at the center of the grand throne room, his massive form exuding authority and power. His expression was unreadable as he studied Cass, as if she were a curiosity to be dissected and analyzed. She kept her back straight, and her gaze steady, her nerves sharp, as she prepared herself for whatever came next. Salkar rose from his throne, his regal presence commanding the room. He spoke slowly, his voice echoing through the vast chamber, his words calculated and deliberate, as if testing the strength of her resolve. He welcomed her to the Dominion court with all the grandeur one would expect from an emperor, yet the underlying tone of his greeting was unmistakable. It was as if he were offering a seat to a beggar instead of a fellow diplomat. The unspoken message was clear: humans were not truly welcome here. They were to be tolerated at best. Cass knew this was only the beginning. The Zathar did not make idle gestures. They had invited her to test her, to measure her against the very ideals they held dear, the ideals of strength, power, and control. They had conquered countless species throughout their reign, bending civilizations to their will, and now they wanted to see if Earth could measure up, if humanity had any place in the vast empire they had built. Zalkar turned to his court, his eyes scanning the assembly. With a flicker of amusement in his gaze, he raised a hand and summoned a holographic display. A map of the galaxy filled the room, the Zathar Dominion stretching across an unimaginable expanse of space. Cass studied it intently, her mind racing as she took in the vastness of their reach. She had always known the Zathar were powerful, but seeing the scale of their empire in full was overwhelming. Lord Zalkar's voice broke through her thoughts once more as he addressed the court. He spoke of peace and cooperation, of trade agreements and diplomatic relations, but it was clear from his words that his true intentions were far different. He was not interested in cooperation, but in asserting the Zathar's dominance. He made it clear that any alliance with Earth would be on the Dominion's terms alone. There would be no equality, no partnership, only submission. Cass held her ground, her mind working quickly to process the situation. She knew this was the moment she had feared, the moment when the Zathar would show their true colors and reveal that this invitation had always been a facade, a test to see how much they could bend humanity to their will. She had prepared for this moment, but the reality of it felt even more overwhelming than she had imagined. Zalkar's eyes shifted to her once more, his expression unreadable yet somehow challenging, as if daring her to speak, daring her to defy the weight of his empire. Cass felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she refused to be intimidated. She straightened her posture and stepped forward into the silence of the court, her voice clear and confident. When she spoke, the words she would say would set the tone for everything that followed. The room fell into a tense silence after Cass's words, as if the entire court held its breath waiting for the Zathar Emperor's response. Zalkar's eyes narrowed, his gaze intense and calculating, as if weighing the audacity of her challenge against the value of her existence. He stood for a moment longer before speaking, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade, declaring that her statement was noted, but he would not allow her to waste their time with empty words. Instead, he offered a test, one that would measure her worth and the worth of her entire species in the eyes of the Dominion. The challenge was not a simple one. It was a multi-tiered trial designed to break her both physically and mentally. She would face the most difficult tests the Zathar had devised to prove her intellect, strength, and cultural adaptability. Cass's mind raced as she took in the details of the trial. The Zathar were known for their ingenuity in such matters, and this would not be a mere formality. It would be a battle for survival and respect. Zalkar's voice echoed through the chamber as he explained the rules. The trial would consist of 3 stages. The first, a test of strategy and intellect against the finest tacticians and strategists in the galaxy. The second, a brutal survival scenario on a hostile world where only the strongest and most resourceful survived. And the third, an arena trial where she would face a champion of the Zathar in physical combat. Cass's stomach twisted as she absorbed the enormity of the challenge. She had never faced anything like this before, but she knew she had no choice. She could not back down, not in front of this court, not in front of the Emperor, not in front of the Zathar, who had already decided that humanity was inferior and unworthy. She had to prove them wrong. She had to prove that Earth had something they could not comprehend, something that made them different from every other species in the galaxy, something they had not seen in 1,000 years of domination. The first stage began, the court watching with anticipation as Cass sat across from the Zathar's top strategists. They were beings of incredible intelligence, trained in the art of war and manipulation, their minds sharp and their tactics flawless. Cass felt the weight of their gaze upon her, but she refused to be intimidated. Her thoughts were clear, her strategy sound, and her resolve unwavering. She responded to every move they made with precision and creativity, thinking outside the box in ways they had not anticipated. One by one, the Zathar strategists were outwitted and eliminated, leaving Cass standing as the victor. She could see the shock in their eyes as they realized she had bested them not through superior knowledge, but through human ingenuity. The second stage took place on a desolate planet, a barren world filled with hostile creatures and treacherous terrain. Cass was left alone with minimal supplies. Her only tools were her wits and her determination. For hours, she navigated the harsh environment, avoiding the predatory beasts that stalked the land, using her resourcefulness to set traps and find food and shelter. When the time came to face the planet's dangers, she was prepared, and once again she emerged victorious, leaving her would-be assassins and predators behind in stunned disbelief. The final stage was the arena, where Cass would face the Zathar's greatest champion, a towering figure of muscle and skill, a being bred for combat. Cass stood alone in the center of the arena, the crowd roaring around her as the champion advanced with deadly intent. She knew that she couldn't win through strength alone. She would have to outthink him, outmaneuver him, and use everything she had learned from the previous trials. As the battle began, Cass danced around her opponent, using speed and agility to avoid his blows, waiting for the moment when she could strike the final blow. The crowd's cheers turned to gasps as the champion fell to the ground, defeated by a human hand. The Zathar court was shaken by Cass's unexpected victories. The atmosphere in the great hall had shifted from a smug confidence to something more akin to unease. The once arrogant dignitaries whispered among themselves, their eyes flicking between the human ambassador and the Emperor. Zalkar's face remained impassive, but Cass could see the flicker of frustration in his eyes. He had not anticipated her success. Not in a million years he had thought the trials would break her. Instead, she had shattered their expectations, and now the court was forced to reckon with a truth they had never expected. Humans were not weak, they were a force to be reckoned with. The Zathar Emperor leaned forward on his throne, his gaze fixed on Cass as she stood tall, her posture unwavering. Despite the challenges she had faced, her trials had not been easy, but she had passed every one with resourcefulness and determination, qualities the Zathar had underestimated in humanity. Until now, Zalkar's voice rang out once more, cutting through the murmurs of the court, his words cold and precise, as he declared the next phase of the trial to be a public demonstration of the value of Earth's people. Cass was not surprised. She had known from the start that the Zathar would not simply accept her victories as enough. They needed something more, something that would prove beyond a doubt that humanity was worthy of their place among the stars, and Zalkar intended to extract it through a more personal test, this time a test of her spirit, a test that would take her to the very heart of the Zathar's idea of power and authority. Cass was escorted from the grand hall to a private chamber, where she was left alone with a holographic projection of the Emperor's face flickering to life in front of her. He stared at her for a long moment before speaking, his tone laced with thinly veiled contempt. He told her that she had impressed him with her abilities, but that would not be enough. She would have to prove her loyalty to the Zathar, to the Dominion, to their way of life. He asked her to swear fealty to him, to bow before his power and acknowledge the supremacy of the Zathar as rulers of the galaxy. Cass stood in silence, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She could feel the immense pressure building around her, but she refused to bow. She had come this far on her own terms, and she would not surrender her dignity. Now she knew the stakes of this moment. This was not just about her own future, it was about humanity's future, and the path they would choose to take in the galaxy. She could feel the eyes of every Zathar in the court watching her, waiting for her answer. Zalkar's face grew harder as the silence stretched on. He demanded an answer, but Cass remained firm. She would not bend to the will of an empire that believed only in domination and subjugation. She would offer no allegiance to a regime that saw her people as nothing more than pawns in their grand design. She would not be intimidated. She would stand her ground and show them that humanity could not be broken. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice steady and clear. She declared that Earth would never bow to tyranny, that humanity's strength lay not in submission, but in unity and freedom, and that if the Zathar were to join Earth in any kind of alliance, it would be on equal terms, nothing less. Zalkar's eyes flashed with fury, but in that moment something else passed through his expression, a flicker of respect perhaps, but more likely annoyance. The Emperor knew this would not be the end of it. He could see that Cass was not easily intimidated, and that the human spirit was not something that could be crushed by threats alone. The silence in the chamber after Cass's defiant statement was deafening. Zalkar's gaze never wavered as he stared at her, his eyes filled with a storm of emotions, anger, amusement, disbelief. But beneath it all there was something else, a cold, calculating respect for the strength of her conviction. He did not expect her to submit so easily, but that only seemed to make her defiance all the more powerful and all the more dangerous to the Zathar Empire. For a long moment neither spoke, and the court waited in anticipation, their collective breath held as if they too were watching a slow-moving disaster unfold. Cass's heart raced, but she held her ground. The weight of the Emperor's eyes on her felt like the press of 1,000 suns, yet she stood unflinching, her posture straight, her chin raised high despite the burning intensity of the stare. Finally Zalkar's lips parted, his voice cold and final as he spoke. He told Cass that her refusal would not go unpunished, that no one defied the Zathar without consequence. She had insulted the Emperor's authority, and now she would face the consequences of her actions. The court began to stir, some of the Zathar lords murmuring amongst themselves, while others glanced at Cass with expressions of shock and curiosity. The tension in the air was palpable, and Cass felt it in her bones, every moment stretching into eternity. Without warning, Zalkar raised his hand and gestured to the guards flanking the chamber. They moved forward quickly, their movements swift and purposeful, as they seized Cass by the arms, pulling her roughly from the center of the room and dragging her towards a set of doors that led to the depths of the palace. The Emperor's voice rang out once more, ordering her to be taken to the dungeons where she would remain until he decided what to do with her. But as she was hauled down the grand corridors of the palace, Cass's mind raced. She knew that this was only a test, a final attempt to break her spirit. The Zathar would not kill her, not yet. They needed her to bend, they needed her to submit, and she could feel the crushing weight of their expectations bearing down on her. She was thrown into a dark cell alone, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind her with a finality that seemed to echo throughout her entire being. But she did not allow fear to settle into her chest. She refused to let it take root. She had come too far and fought too hard to let it end in a dungeon cell. Cass paced the cold stone floor, her mind working furiously. She knew she couldn't let this setback stop her. She had proven herself time and time again in the trials, and now she had to do the same in this moment. She would not allow the Zathar to break her. They had underestimated her before, and she would make sure they did again. Hours passed in the dark cell, but Cass's resolve only grew stronger. She knew the Emperor was watching, waiting for her to crack, but she would not give him the satisfaction. She had come to Zathar Prime for one reason: to prove that humanity had the strength to stand alongside the galaxy's most powerful empires, and she would do whatever it took to make that happen. The hours in the dark cell stretched on, and Cass refused to let the silence overwhelm her. She had seen the flicker of doubt in the eyes of the Zathar court during the trial victories. She knew they were not entirely certain about the human spirit. The Emperor's attempts to break her had failed, and now she had to turn that failure into an opportunity. She could not remain in the shadows forever. She needed to act, and she needed to act now. In the stillness of her cell, a plan began to form in her mind, a bold proposition, one that would force the Zathar to reconsider their perception of humanity and the way the galaxy was structured. If the Emperor would not listen to reason, she would give him something else to consider: a vision of a future where the Zathar did not hold all the power, a future where humans could lead alongside the other species of the galaxy as equals. Cass's mind raced as she began to formulate her words. The plan took shape quickly. With each passing minute, her thoughts sharpened into a clear and coherent argument. When she felt the time was right, she waited patiently for the guards to arrive to take her back to the court. The tension between the Zathar and herself was thick in the air, but Cass had no intention of backing down, not now, not after everything she had fought for. Finally, the guards arrived. They unlocked the heavy door and dragged her back through the halls of the palace. The weight of their hands on her arms only spurred her resolve. She would not allow them to see her falter, not even for a moment. When they returned her to the throne room, the court was still filled with the same tense energy. The Zathar Emperor sat at his throne looking down on her, with an expression that was equal parts frustration and curiosity. But Cass was not intimidated. She had learned from the trials. She knew what she was capable of, and now it was time to show them. Zalkar looked at her and sneered as if expecting her to be broken, but Cass stood tall. She had made her decision, And now it was time to speak. She looked directly at the Emperor and began to speak in a calm but steady voice, her words clear and unwavering. Lord Salkar, you have made your power known. You have demonstrated what it means to dominate and control. But I ask you this, what is the cost of that power? What have the Zathor gained by conquering every world in their path and forcing others to bend to their will? She paused and took a step forward, her eyes locked on the Emperor's. You have ruled through fear and strength, but there is another way, another path that does not rely on subjugation and tyranny. The silence in the room was deafening. The entire court was watching her every word, every movement, and Cass could feel the weight of their gaze. She could feel the challenge in the air, but she pressed on, her voice growing stronger with each sentence. I propose an alliance not based on your dominance, but on mutual respect and cooperation. Imagine a galaxy where strength is not measured by how much you can control, but by how well you can work together. Imagine a future where humanity can stand alongside the Zathar and other species, not as subordinates, but as equals. Cass paused, letting the words sink in her eyes, never leaving the Emperor's face. She could see the conflict in his expression, the flicker of something more than contempt. There was curiosity, there was doubt, and even a hint of respect, but she knew that this was not going to be easy. Humanity offers something you cannot see, a future built not on domination, but on unity and growth, if you would but consider it. Zalkar did not speak immediately. The room held its breath, the Emperor's mind working through her words as the galaxy's future hung in the balance. The silence that followed Cass's words was unlike anything she had experienced before in the Zathar court. It was not the silence of judgment or condemnation. It was the silence of calculation. The Emperor's eyes remained fixed on her, his expression unreadable, but she could feel the tension in the air, as if the very atmosphere was waiting for his response. Lord Salkar had been a ruler for centuries, his empire built on the foundations of fear and absolute control. He was not accustomed to being challenged, not like this, not by a human. Cass's heart pounded in her chest, but she did not waver. She had given her proposition, and now it was out there for all to see. The Zathar might try to ignore it, but they couldn't erase the words from their minds. They couldn't pretend that humanity didn't have something different to offer. The Zathar might be powerful, but they had their limitations, and Cass knew that if she could make them see it, then humanity would have a chance. Zalkar finally broke the silence, his voice low and steady, but laced with an edge of irritation. You are bold, human, far bolder than I expected. But do you truly believe that such an alliance is possible? Do you think that the Zathar would ever give up their power, their control, for such a naive ideal? He leaned forward in his throne, his eyes narrowing. The galaxy has always been ruled by strength and domination. That is the way of the Zathar. It is the way of the universe itself. Cass met his gaze without flinching. Strength is not only about control, it's about the ability to adapt, to grow, and to work with others. Strength is not a finite resource. It is something that multiplies when shared. The Zathar have conquered much, but they have also isolated themselves from the galaxy's true potential. An alliance with humanity and other species would unlock that potential. Zalkar's gaze flickered to the assembled court, who were listening intently. The Emperor had ruled with an iron fist, but even he knew that the galaxy was changing. The old ways of dominance and conquest were no longer as effective as they once were. The rise of new civilizations, like the Terrans, was evidence of that. But Cass's words were not just about challenging the old ways. They were about offering a solution, a way forward that could potentially benefit both the Zathar and humanity. Your people have only begun to explore the stars, Salkar said with a dismissive wave of his hand. You are nothing compared to the power of the Dominion. Why should we consider your proposal when the cost would be far too great? Cass took a deep breath, her mind working quickly. She had anticipated this line of thought. She had expected Salkar to view humanity as too insignificant to be considered a true partner in the galactic stage. But she had a response ready, something that would turn his doubts back on him. Perhaps we are small in comparison to the might of the Zathar, she said, her voice steady. But we are adaptable, we learn quickly, and we innovate in ways that your empire cannot even fathom. We have already begun to make strides in space exploration and technology. In the short time since our first contact with the wider galaxy, we are not a primitive species anymore. She paused for a moment, allowing her words to sink in. In fact, it is the Zathar who are falling behind you cling to the old ways of conquest and control, but the galaxy is changing, it is evolving, and the empires that cannot adapt will be left behind. Cass's eyes did not leave the Emperor's face. She could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes now. He had not expected such a response from her. He had thought that her human spirit would falter under the pressure, but she had proven him wrong time and time again. Now she had him thinking, and she could feel the scales shifting in her favor. The Emperor's hand twitched slightly as he sat back in his throne, clearly considering her words. The court remained still, no one daring to speak. The Emperor's gaze lingered on Cass for what felt like an eternity, the weight of his scrutiny pressing down on her. But she did not flinch. She stood firm, her conviction stronger than ever before. The silence that followed was charged with tension and uncertainty. The Zathar court watched intently, every noble and dignitary hanging on the Emperor's next words. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the very fate of the galaxy was about to be decided. Zalkar leaned back in his throne, his fingers steepled before him as he considered Cass's words. There was no denying that she had made a powerful argument. Her vision of the future was not something he could simply dismiss. It was a challenge to the very foundation of everything he had ever believed in, a challenge to the supremacy of the Zathar, a challenge that he was not prepared to ignore. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Zalkar spoke, his voice low and measured. "You are right, human. The galaxy is changing, and perhaps there is more to strength than domination and control." He paused for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. "But the Zathar will never bow to another species, no matter how promising your arguments may be." Cass's heart raced, but she did not interrupt. She knew that this was the moment when the Emperor would decide if humanity had any place in the galaxy, or if they would remain a footnote in the history of the Zathar Empire. However, Zalkar continued, "I have been impressed by your resilience, your ingenuity, and your boldness." His eyes flickered to the assembled court, and Cass could feel the weight of their gazes upon her. It is not often that one sees such spirit in the face of overwhelming odds, and I will admit that your people have earned my respect. He leaned forward slightly, his tone softening just a fraction. "You have shown the Zathar that perhaps there is more to this galaxy than just power and conquest. Perhaps there is something more worth fighting for." The room was silent as the court absorbed his words. Cass's breath caught in her throat. She had not expected this, not in this way. The Emperor was not offering her a victory, not yet, but he was offering something else, something far more valuable, a chance to prove that humanity could stand as an equal among the stars. Zalkar's gaze turned once more to Cass, his expression still hard, but now there was something new in his eyes, a spark of curiosity, and perhaps something else, something deeper, something that had not been there before. "You wish for an alliance based on equality," he said slowly, "and you believe that humanity's strength lies in its ability to adapt to the changing tides of the galaxy." He paused for a moment, then spoke again. "I will allow you to present your case further in front of the court, and we shall see if your people can truly offer what you claim." Cass's heart surged with hope. She had not won yet, but she had been given the chance to prove herself further. The Emperor had not dismissed her out of hand. He had opened the door to a future where humanity could stand as equals in the galactic stage. And now she had to take that opportunity and make the most of it. The court was still and silent as Zalkar rose from his throne, the court following his lead as he moved toward Cass. "If your people can truly live up to the promise you have shown today," he said with a flicker of a smile, "then perhaps there is a place for them in this galaxy after all." Cass stood tall. She had made it this far, and now it was time to take the final step. She had proven humanity's worth in the face of overwhelming odds, and now she would take the next step toward building the future. She had always believed in a future where humanity stood beside the greatest powers in the galaxy, not as subordinates, but as equals.